Hello and welcome to lecture number 42. This is topic 3.7, the color line and double consciousness in American society. In this topic, we're going to discuss these two concepts with the help of two written works composed in the middle of an era known as the nadir of American race relations, which lasted roughly from the end of Reconstruction in 1877 to the early 20th century. We'll be looking at works by two influential black writers, Paul Laurence Dunbar, a poet, and W.E.B. Du Bois, an intellectual and civil rights activist. The learning objective for today is to explain how groundbreaking texts like Dunbar's We Wear the Mask and Du Bois's The Soul of Black Folk, and the dialogues these texts generated portray black humanity and the effects of racism on African Americans at the turn of the 20th century. Before we delve deeper into that conversation, I want to give you some background on the two texts. The first is We Wear the Mask by Paul Laurence Dunbar, written in 1896. Dunbar was born to formerly enslaved people in Dayton, Ohio. His father was a former runaway slave who served in the Union Army during the Civil War, while his mother was born into slavery and was emancipated at the conclusion of the war. Dunbar excelled in school but was barred from pursuing higher academic goals due to his race. Despite academic potential, black Americans at the time were largely excluded from higher education, an unfortunate trend that reflected broader patterns of racial inequality in the post-Reconstruction America. The only opportunities they had open to them were historically black colleges and universities, or HBCUs. Dunbar ended up working menial jobs, including as an elevator operator, but he continued to write in his spare time. In 1896, he published a book of poetry titled Lyrics of Lowly Life, which gained him national notoriety. We Wear the Mask, one of his most famous poems, was included in this collection. Dunbar died of tuberculosis at the age of 33 in 1906, but his poetry laid the groundwork for the Harlem Renaissance, a cultural movement that would bloom in the 1910s and 1920s. The Harlem Renaissance brought national attention to black artists, writers, and musicians, reshaping cultural landscapes in America. His poem, We Wear the Mask, was written during the nadir when African Americans faced harsh conditions and intense discrimination. The poem reflects African American suffering with a tone of both quiet resignation and defiance. Now let's examine the poem itself. It's brief, so here it is. We wear the mask that grins and lies. It hides our cheeks and shades our eyes. This debt we pay to human guile. With torn and bleeding hearts we smile, and mouth with myriad subtleties. Why should the world be overwise in counting all our tears and sighs? Nay, let them only see us while we wear the mask. We smile, but O great Christ, our cries to thee from tortured souls arise. We sing, but oh the clay is vile, beneath our feet and long the mile. But let the world stream otherwise, we wear the mask. We'll discuss the imagery and metaphors that Dunbar uses here in greater detail shortly, but now we're going to go to W.E.B. Du Bois's The Soul of Black Folk. So this was a collection of essays published in 1903. Du Bois was a Harvard-educated intellectual and civil rights leader, and he co-founded the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, or the NAACP, in 1909. Du Bois was the first African American to earn a PhD from Harvard, an achievement that underscored the significance of black academic success in a segregated society. He was also known for his rivalry with Booker T. Washington, a prominent black leader who advocated for vocational education and economic self-reliance for black Americans. Du Bois, however, opposed Washington's approach, advocating instead for political action and higher education for African Americans. In The Souls of Black Folk, Du Bois challenges white supremacist ideas and Washington's accommodationist strategies. He critiques systemic racism and calls for the integration of black Americans into American institutions, particularly in education. At the time, historically black colleges and universities, or HBCUs, were the only realistic pathway to higher education for black Americans. Founded after the Civil War, HBCUs like Howard University and Fisk University became critical institutions for black intellectual development, though they were often underfunded and overcrowded. Du Bois argued that the solution was not to isolate black education, but to integrate black Americans into all forms of higher learning. Each chapter of The Souls of Black Folk begins with lyrics of a spiritual and musical notation, which ties the work to African American musical traditions rooted in resistance. This inclusion of spirituals, often sung by enslaved people as coded messages or expressions of hope, emphasize the deep cultural legacy of black resistance. Two symbols from these works stand out: the mask in Dunbar's poem and the veil in Du Bois's essays. The mask in Dunbar's We Wear the Mask represents the facade that black Americans are forced to wear to survive in a hostile society. This mask hides their suffering from the white world, which only sees a false front. The mask is a metaphor for the survival mechanism Black people developed during Jim Crow, an era when open expressions of pain could invite violence. It also acts as a barrier that isolates Black Americans from the rest of society, forcing them to bear their struggles alone. Similarly, Du Bois uses the veil in the souls of Black folk as a symbol of literal and metaphorical separation of Black and white societies. African Americans can see and understand white society through the veil, but white Americans cannot see Black people clearly. The veil is also a metaphor for the othering of Black Americans, who are often seen as inferior or invisible by the dominant culture. This veil distorts the way African Americans view themselves because they're constantly measuring themselves against a society that does not truly see them. Du Bois lifts the veil in his writing, helping white readers understand what it means to be Black in America during this time. Moving on to the next concept in Du Bois's work, the color line. This term refers to the racial discrimination and segregation that defined American life at the turn of the 20th century. It encompasses systemic inequalities in education, employment, political rights, and social interactions, all of which were implemented shortly after the end of Reconstruction. Du Bois famously stated, "The problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line." He acknowledges that people in other countries and continents were fighting against the same oppression, and furthermore, it was severely limiting progress in the United States because it also restricted whites in America. This declaration, made in 1903, accurately predicted the enduring struggle for civil rights that would shape the next century. The second key concept from Du Bois's is double consciousness. It first appears in a passage from the essay Of Our Spiritual Strivings, where Du Bois writes, "It is a peculiar sensation, this double consciousness, the sense of always looking at oneself through the eyes of others, of measuring one's soul by the tape of a world that looks on in amused contempt and pity. One ever feels his two-ness, an American, a Negro, two souls, two thoughts, two unreconciled strivings, two warring ideals in one dark body whose dogged strength alone keeps it from being torn asunder." Here Du Bois describes the experience of subordinated groups, particularly Black Americans during the Jim Crow era. African Americans live with two identities, one defined by their African heritage and another shaped by their status as Americans. Out of these two identities, one African and one American, one of the identities, the African one, is perceived as a problem by the other. So therefore, this concept helps highlight the internal conflict Black Americans face, as they're both part of American society and alienated from it due to the systemic racism. Du Bois argued that the cause of the double consciousness was the result of social alienation created through racism and discrimination. It makes it difficult because African Americans are then not only able to fully embrace their Black identity. The psychological toll of navigating this split identity is profound, but Du Bois also sees it as an opportunity for Black Americans. For one, it creates a heightened sense of awareness for African Americans about society as a whole. They can read situations and put on the identity required for each interaction, an early hint into what will later be termed code switching. Additionally, Du Bois saw an element of agency and resistance in this concept, because as long as African Americans did not erase their African sense of self, they were standing up against white supremacy. In summary, both Dunbar's We Wear the Mask and Du Bois's The Soul of Black Folk describe the Black experience during the Nadir period. Both works use powerful metaphors, Dunbar's mask and Du Bois's veil, to show how African Americans were unseen and misunderstood by white society. Du Bois has identified the color line as the central problem of the 20th century and defines double consciousness as the internal conflict that African Americans face as they try to reconcile their identity in a racist society. Ultimately, while double consciousness results from racism, it also fosters a sense of resilience and adaptation in African Americans. Du Bois's analysis of double consciousness remains a foundational concept in the study of race and identity in America, influencing future scholars and activists alike. Thank you for watching. If you would like to watch the next lecture, click the thumbnail on the screen. And if you would like more resources to help you study, you can visit apushslides.com/AFAM. I wish you the best of luck with your studies, and I hope to see you back on the next lecture.